A 16-year-old boy was heading home after hanging out with his pals. His entire family was waiting for him there. His father, stepmother, and 2 little sisters, whom he adored immensely, were all at home. When Mark entered the house, he immediately realized something terrible had occurred. The whole family, including the 2 young girls, had been brutally slaughtered. The entire house was filled with blood. This incident became the most gruesome crime in Torsby's history. Dedra Lynn Mims was born on July 23, 1967, to Kendall and Elizabeth. Dedra had an older sister, Kendra, and a younger sister, Tedra. Not only were the girls' names distinctive, but they themselves were unique as well. Dedra and her sisters were born and raised in a small town called Clanton, Alabama, which at that time had a population of only 6,000 people. Clanton is situated halfway between Alabama's 2 largest cities, Montgomery and Birmingham. This made it an ideal location for those involved in business and manufacturing. Clanton is renowned for its annual peach harvests. Even the water tower there is painted to resemble a giant peach. While still attending high school, Dedra met her first love, Tommy Lee Hunt. Both young people came from large families and were themselves oriented towards starting a family. Right after finishing school, Tommy proposed to Dedra. Soon after, the couple wed and moved into their own home in Thorsby. At the age of 21, Dedra gave birth to a girl named Chelsea Marie Hunt. And just 6 months after Chelsea's birth, another little bundle of joy arrived, Chalisa Nicole Hunt. Being a mom is not only a joy but also a full-time job, and Dedra took pride in her work. She was an excellent mother, patient, sensitive, and very cheerful. At the same time, Dedra was excessively straightforward and had strong moral principles. The girls inherited their mother's curly hair and their father's eyes. Dedra loved dressing them in matching outfits, so they looked like twins with cute dimples on their cheeks and small button noses, as most children have. The only differences between them were a slight age gap and hair color. Chelsea was dark-haired, while Chalisa was fair-haired. Despite their outward similarities, their personalities differed greatly from each other. Chelsea grew up as a tomboy, played on the softball team in the junior league, spoke her mind freely, and always stood up for her younger sister. Chalisa, on the other hand, was a little princess, polite, graceful, loved dolls, dressing up in pretty dresses and styling her hair. Once at the zoo, they put a parrot on her shoulder, but the girl wasn't interested in the exotic bird. She was more concerned about keeping her curls neat. Every year, the girls would dress up for Halloween, celebrating holidays as a family. And in spring, Chelsea and Chalisa would help their aunt plant flowers in the backyard. When the plants bloomed, the girls would gather them on Mother's Day, take them to church, and give them to all the moms. The sisters loved each other, but of course, there were occasional small disputes. They always took their disagreements to heart, but by the end of the day, usually one of them would apologize, and they'd start giggling and running around the house happily again. Friends, over 90% of viewers watch videos without subscribing to the channel. Check if you're subscribed. If not, please be so kind as to subscribe to the channel to support me. In 1994, when Chelsea turned 5 and Chalisa was about 3.5, Tommy and Dedra separated. This often happens when people marry at such a young age. From high school to adulthood, many changes occurred in the couple's lives. Although they split up, they decided to do everything possible to ensure the divorce wouldn't affect the children. Tommy stayed with the girls in Thorsby so they wouldn't have to change schools or move elsewhere. The parents believed this stability was crucial for their future development. And Dedra, though heartbroken about parting with her little ones, tried her best to hide it. Mom and Dad made sure their daughters didn't feel any tension between the parents. Chelsea and Chalisa spent weekends with Dedra while living with Tommy the rest of the time. The man quickly adapted to his new role, learning to cook, clean, and even braid hair. Tommy knew Dedra would always remain part of his family and respected her decision to keep the surname Hunt. The transition to separate lives was quite challenging, but the parents never showed this to their daughters. Deidre attempted to rebuild her personal life. She started meeting men and soon found a new partner. Randy Duke was almost 10 years older than Deidre. He was attentive to all her needs and even suggested she move into his house. Soon after, she introduced him to Chelsea and Shalisa and was amazed at how easily and quickly he got along with her children. Randy Gerald Duke was born in Chicago, Illinois. However, he spent his childhood in Alabama with his numerous siblings. After finishing school, he became a plumber, then married a woman named Tara Eccles. In 1980, the couple had a son, whom they named Mark Anthony Duke. Unfortunately, the couple's relationship didn't last long. At that time, Randy wasn't prepared to become a father, so the child remained in his mother's custody. Tara struggled to make ends meet. She lived in a dilapidated rural house with no toilet or running water, making it very difficult to provide for her son. Perhaps that's why, when the boy turned 10, he essentially reunited with his father. At 14, Mark moved in with Randy, who was then in his 30s. Randy took out a loan to buy a house in Pelham, a 30-minute drive from Thorsby. It was a beautiful 2-story home with 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, a huge backyard, fireplace, living room, and spacious kitchen, the perfect family home. To keep up with the mortgage payments, Randy worked 2 jobs. He was a plumber at one company and an employee of the Alabama Alcoholic Beverage Control Board. For a while, the man was engaged to a woman named Donna Colla Francesco, a school teacher who cared for his son Mark. Because Randy worked so much, he couldn't devote much time to raising his son. Donna drove the boy to football practice, went shopping with him, and knew all his friends. So when Donna and Randy's 4-year relationship ended, it deeply affected Mark. The teenager felt as if he'd lost another mother. Randy knew how hard his son took the breakup with Donna, so he tried his best to become a better father to him. When Deidre, Chelsea, and Shalisa entered Mark and Randy's lives, the man saw it as a great opportunity to create a strong, close-knit family, finally providing stability for his son. Randy genuinely loved Deidre's daughters and was always attentive to them, as well as to his son Mark. Deidre moved in with Randy, and just a year later, he proposed to her, which she accepted. The whole family enthusiastically prepared for the upcoming celebration, choosing the venue, outfits, compiling guest lists and menus for the festive dinner. It was 1997, Randy was 39, Deidre 29, Mark had turned 16 and was in high school. Chelsea had entered 2nd grade at nearly 8 years old, while Chalisa had recently celebrated her 6th birthday. Mark became an older brother to the girls, whom they simply adored. His friends said he cared for them so deeply that he was even willing to give his life for Chelsea and Chalisa. During winter break, the girls went on vacation with their father, Tommy, and his sister, Tara. They were allowed to eat cupcakes for breakfast, jump on the bed, stay up late, and watch movies. It was one of those magical vacations where you cherish every moment. They had no idea then that it would be their last holiday together. On Friday, March 21st, 1997, little Chalisa participated in her very first beauty pageant at Thorsby Elementary School. It was the weekend before Easter, so all the students were dressed in spring colors. Chalisa wore a white ruffled dress, white socks, and white shoes. Her fair hair was curled into tight ringlets, and a happy smile lit up her face. That day, she looked like an angel. Although Shalisa won a respectable 2nd place, she enjoyed it so much that she told her parents she wanted to participate in the next contest. That evening, they returned to Tommy's, where Deidre helped her daughters change and pack for the weekend so they could spend a couple of days with her and Randy. The girls hugged and kissed their dad goodbye, and Deidre promised to bring them back Sunday evening. Everything was going as usual. It was just another fun weekend at Randy's in Pelham. Except everything did not go as planned. At 8:40 p.m. on Sunday, March 23, 1997, the evening Deidre was supposed to return the girls to Tommy's house, a call came into the 911 dispatch center. On the other end, an agitated male voice, on the verge of hysteria, reported that his entire family had been killed. The operator quickly dispatched a rapid response team to Randy and Dedra's house on Chandawood Drive. Upon arrival, they found a frantic teenager standing outside the building in the darkness. It was Mark Duke. He was the one who called the police and reported the tragedy at the family home. The rapid response team realized that if Mark's family was harmed, he might be in danger too. It was possible the perpetrators were still in the house. That's why they sent the young man with an officer to a juvenile center where he was placed in custody until all circumstances could be clarified. The police knew the teenager had experienced trauma and wanted to ensure Mark received qualified assistance. The team arriving at the scene immediately understood a crime had occurred in the house. They promptly cordoned off the perimeter with tape and called in investigators for serious crimes. Outside Randy Duke's house, 4 vehicles were parked: 2 sports pickups, Dedra's car, and Randy's work truck. The house itself had 3 levels, as it had a basement in addition to the first and second floors. Upon entering, detectives found complete disarray. Various items were scattered throughout the house. This is typical in robberies when criminals search for valuables and simply toss everything else out of closets. Right there on the living room floor near the fireplace, a man lay face down, surrounded by a pool of already congealed blood. It was obvious he had received multiple wounds to his head and back. Next to him lay a kitchen knife blade without a handle. Likely, such force was used that the handle broke during use. Judging by the brutality of the entire scene, whoever did this must have felt intense anger towards the deceased. This was most likely a personal vendetta, because in most cases, a knife is used by people in a state of extreme rage, that is, by someone who harbors strong feelings and emotions towards the victim. As the police continued their search, they were nearly brought to tears. They dreaded what scenes awaited them in the other rooms. In the living room, next to the sofa, stood a coffee table where children often drew. Now, 2 unfinished pencil drawings lay on the table, spattered with blood droplets. It was emotionally jarring to see the contrast between a happy child's fantasies and the grim reality. Detectives didn't want to think about what had happened or what else they might find in this house, because right there on the couch was even more blood, and worse, there lay knocked-out human teeth. From the living room to the hallway where the stairs were located, a blood trail led, and it didn't appear to be from the man lying by the fireplace. This meant someone else was hurt, and officers wondered if it was a criminal or other victims. Investigators went upstairs and found 3 bedrooms. 2 were at the front of the house, while the blood trail led down the hall to the main bedroom at the back. That room was also in disarray. Dresser drawers were pulled out, closets open, all clothes strewn across the floor. There was also an adjoining bathroom. The door leading to the bathroom consisted of 6 wooden panels, one of which had a hole punched through it. A large pool of blood had seeped under the doors into the bedroom. This house could be considered one of the bloodiest crime scenes local authorities had encountered. One detective tried to enter the bathroom, but the door was either locked or blocked by something. He peered through the hole made at doorknob level. Apparently, someone before them had also wanted to get in there. It turned out another body lay inside. It was a woman, presumably the lady of the house. Once the police managed to enter the bathroom, an incomprehensible reality unfolded before them. What they had feared seeing. In the back, behind the curtain, lay a little girl with fair curls. It was clear she was no longer alive, the cause being a cut on her neck. This was the most difficult task the officers had to undertake. Now they had to move on and check each room in this house. They first returned to the hallway and examined a bedroom clearly belonging to a teenage boy. Everything inside was ransacked, and symbols resembling local gang signs were carved into the drywall. Investigators didn't yet know what the strange abbreviation might mean, but first guesses emerged that all this carnage could have been orchestrated for some satanic ritual. The police had one more room to check. This was the final act. On the floor, face down, lay a small figure with long, curly hair, only darker than the first girl's. The entire bedroom was splattered with dark red, on the walls, on the furniture, under the body, on the floor, and even some on the ceiling. Judging by the position in which the schoolgirl was found, she had been dragged out from under the bed and killed. There were multiple torn wounds on the body, and nearby lay a blood-soaked black bandana, which was subsequently taken as evidence. This time, the detectives couldn't hold back their tears. The tiny hands showed signs of defensive wounds. The little one had fought with all her might in her last painful and agonizing minutes. She had struggled for her life. A young investigator, who had children of the same age at home, barely contained himself. He couldn't imagine what kind of monster could raise a hand against these little angels. The older detective knew that, no matter how difficult it was, they needed to maintain composure because they had to figure out who could have sent an entire family to the other side. Less than 30 minutes after the investigation began, a car pulled into the driveway. A man jumped out and ran to the front entrance. At that stage, the detectives couldn't be fully certain whose bodies were found in the house. They only knew from Mark Duke's 911 call, where he identified his father, Randy. So the police had no idea who this man rushing to enter the house was. When the stranger looked into the officer's eyes, they got the impression that this person definitely knew what had happened inside. He introduced himself as Tommy Hunt and said he was the father of 2 girls visiting the house. And then the detective realized he now had to deliver terrible news to a parent. The officer held Tommy by the shoulder and told him that everyone in this house had died. At that moment, Tommy broke down. It was such a strong display of emotion and grief that the detective couldn't determine whether the man was genuinely upset or playing a role. What were the chances that Tommy would appear at his ex-wife's house before the police notified relatives? How could he have known something had happened here? Tommy explained that he was the girl's primary guardian, and Deidre, his ex-wife, was supposed to bring Chelsea and Chalisa back several hours ago. When she didn't show up, didn't call back, and worse, ignored his calls, Tommy grew worried. It was already 9:30 p.m. and the girls should have been in bed, but they still weren't home. That's when he decided to drive over and find out the reason for such behavior. Parking at the house, he noticed the commotion everywhere and police cars. Tommy immediately knew something bad had happened. Tommy was taken to the station and questioned. He was the deceased Deidre's ex-husband and could provide valuable information to the authorities. Tommy had last seen his daughters and ex-wife after Friday's beauty pageant at the elementary school. The man admitted that, of course, his divorce from Deidre had been quite difficult. They had been in love since high school, but now emotions had settled. He saw that both the children and their mother were happy with Randy, so their relationship had evolved into a friendly one. According to Tommy, Deidre was an excellent mother, and he didn't know anyone who would want to harm her or the children. As it initially appeared that Tommy had no connection to the crime, he was released. The detectives then decided to talk to Mark Duke, the son of the deceased Randy Duke. Investigators wanted to understand what he saw when he entered his home that evening. The young man, who was temporarily in the juvenile center, explained that he had spent the weekend at his friend's house, 16-year-old Mike Ellison, on his parents' farm. Mike's father needed help to dismantle an old, dilapidated barn, so he called his son's friends. When the weekend ended, Mark was driven home as he had to go to school the next morning. He thought it would be a typical Sunday evening. The girls would be home until Deidre drove them back to Tommy's house, and the family would watch TV together in the living room. But when the teenagers arrived at the house, no lights were on inside. The front door was closed, and Mark opened it with his key. Entering, the boy turned on the light in the hall, and when he turned towards the living room, he saw the figure of a man lying near the fireplace. Mark called out to his father, but Randy didn't respond. Then the boy saw a blood trail leading from the living room to the second-floor stairs. Mark was afraid to go further. He grabbed the cordless phone, ran out to the yard, and dialed 911. The forensic examination determined that Randy, Chelsea, and Chalisa had received fatal stab wounds, while Dedra had been shot. Randy, the homeowner, had also been shot several times. At first, detectives wondered if one of the adult family members could have carried out the massacre and then taken their own life. But after searching the house, they found no firearms. Their initial theory didn't explain the knocked-out teeth on the couch and the hole punched in the bathroom door. More than a dozen shell casings of .32 and .45 caliber were found at the crime scene. This meant two types of firearms were used, so there could have been two perpetrators. The knife blade found in the living room matched other knives in the kitchen set. This meant the assailants only brought guns with them. The autopsy of the deceased showed that rigor mortis had set in long ago. Most likely, all victims had been dead for more than 36 hours, long before the 911 call was made. Therefore, the detectives concluded that this crime was unlikely to be related to a religious holiday. The bodies were found on Palm Sunday, but the crime had been committed much earlier. Nevertheless, they were still puzzled by the inscriptions on the wall in Mark's room. Now that the police had more details about the timeline of events, they returned to speak with Mark, hoping he could provide them with some additional information or recall what his family was doing before the attack. The young man told investigators he didn't know what was happening at home, as he had been at Mike's place all weekend. On Saturday evening, he and his friends went to the movie theater to watch Scream. He even still had his ticket stub. Mark hadn't been home since Friday. The two friends who had given him a ride that evening came to the police station themselves to give statements. They were 19-year-old Brandon Samry and 17-year-old David Collins. The guys confirmed everything Mark had previously said. The father of one of the teenagers also verified that they had spent the whole weekend taking apart a shed on his farm. It appeared that the last person to have seen the children and Dedra was Tommy Hunt, her ex-husband. Randy and Dedra's families had already been notified about the tragedy involving their loved ones, so all the relatives had gathered at the police station waiting for answers. Neighbors crowded around the house where the tragedy occurred. They wanted to know what was going on because none of them had heard any disturbances at Randy's house. Throughout the weekend, everything had been quiet and calm. Pelham was considered a peaceful town. Every resident believed that their home's walls guaranteed complete safety. But now, people were afraid to go out to their backyards in the evening because no one knew where the killers who had harmed Chelsea and Chalisa were hiding. On Monday, the day after the entire family's demise, the whole Thorsby school district was shocked by the horrific news. The girls' young friends encountered death for the first time, and for them, it was a real trauma. The children couldn't understand how this could have happened. Just last week, they were having fun and playing together, and now Chelsea and Chalisa were gone. It's incredibly difficult to explain to a child that they will never see their friend again. The school arranged for a counseling psychologist to be available for elementary students in case anyone needed support. News of the brutal slaying spread throughout the community and beyond. Media vans and reporters flocked to Pelham. All of this increased pressure on the police, and detectives rushed to solve the crime while the trail was still fresh. The autopsy findings were staggering. The victims not only endured physical pain, but were likely terrified. Even officers who arrived first at the scene couldn't shake the horrific images from their minds for years afterward. During the investigation, a theory emerged that the entire family might have been targeted due to Randy's work. He wasn't just a plumber, but also served on Alabama's Alcoholic Beverage Control Board. Randy was an undercover agent in the Bureau of Illegal Drug Distribution Control. The 1990s saw an opioid epidemic in the USA. Prescription drugs were not only given to patients, but also sold on the side. Randy Duke would get acquainted with gang members, learn how they obtained controlled substances, and pass this information to the police. The issue was that afterward, he had to testify in court using his real name. Randy indeed had enemies harboring grudges for ruining their lives. However, a thorough examination of Randy's undercover work revealed no significant connections to released criminals. Detectives reviewed Randy's bank records, but his accounts were in order. He hadn't made purchases in questionable places, withdrawn large sums, or owed anyone money in recent years. Time was running out, and the perpetrator was still at large. The state governor offered a $20,000 reward, and tips poured in. Many members of the public pointed fingers at the family's only survivor, 16-year-old Mark Duke. People who knew Mark from middle school described him as a troubled teen. When younger, he was a very quiet, introverted boy. Schoolwork was extremely challenging for him. This wasn't surprising, given the conditions in which the child grew up. As Mark got older, behavioral problems compounded his poor academic performance. He acted out so much that Randy, who hadn't been involved in his upbringing during childhood, decided to send the boy to a boot camp for troubled teens. He genuinely wanted to help his son, but after returning, Mark's behavior worsened. It seemed the young man was constantly angry at the world. No one could pinpoint the exact cause of such conduct, and everyone chalked it up to teenage angst. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you like this video, it's really important. Investigators discovered that Mark and his group of friends called themselves a gang. It wasn't a gang in the traditional sense. They were more like wannabes. The group included about 10 young people, among them 4 guys: Mark Duke, Brandon Samra, Mike Ellison, and David Collins. These were the boys Mark had spent the weekend with and gone to the movies. To understand the situation, detectives had to thoroughly examine each of the guys. They were typical teenagers. Some had dropped out of school and caused trouble for local residents with their behavior. But they had no serious criminal records beyond that. Plus, Mark seemed to have no motive for attacking his family. Then detectives received another tip. A man called and said he'd heard information, albeit through several sources, that a young man had confessed to his girlfriend about killing his entire family. This girl's name was Sarah Woodruff. She was only 14 years old and was dating none other than Mark Duke. Detectives contacted Sarah, and on Tuesday morning, the 25th, she came to the station with her mother. The girl said she'd noticed cuts on Mark's hands and asked where he got them. Her boyfriend suddenly started talking about being at his father's house with his friends on Saturday evening. Sarah then shared details that only someone present at the crime scene could have known. She didn't actually believe Mark, thinking he was just trying to impress her and had made up this wild story. Looking back, detectives remembered something odd about Mark's 911 call. Initially, the boy told the dispatcher that his whole family was dead, but later during questioning, he said he'd only seen Randy lying by the fireplace and a bloody trail leading upstairs. So how could he have known everyone else was dead too? When asked about this, he explained that he'd noticed Dedra's car in the driveway, but hadn't seen the woman herself. However, the bloody trail clearly indicated his entire family had been attacked. It was strange that he hadn't at least checked on the girls, but he couldn't be blamed for that, unless, of course, he was responsible. Though police began to suspect Mark, they lacked concrete evidence to charge him. That's when Sarah, his 14-year-old girlfriend, came to their aid. Despite her fear, the girl agreed to wear a recording device under her clothes and managed to capture a conversation among the friends discussing the horrific events of that night. Mike Ellison and Brandon Samra admitted involvement in the crime, but didn't provide details. Now the police had real cause to question them separately. It's possible the teenagers were just trying to appear tough and fabricating the whole horror. First, Mike Ellison was brought to the interrogation room. The conversation lasted several hours. Initially, he denied involvement, but then gave in and presented his version of events. According to Mike, Mark Duke bore full responsibility for the family's slaughter. He claimed Mark had taken the lives of his father, Randy, Deidre, Chelsea, and Chalisa. The other 3 teenagers had merely given him a ride to the family home. Brandon went inside with Mark, while Mike himself and David Collins waited in the car. David corroborated Mike's statement. All that remained was to question Brandon Samra to understand what really happened on that fateful evening. At first, the young man adamantly denied his participation in the crime, but when they played the recording of the conversation where he boasted about his brutality, Brandon gave in and told them everything. Mark Duke had been hanging out with friends for weeks, constantly talking about how angry he was at his father for being too strict. The young man blamed Randy for spending his childhood years with his mother in deprivation, while his father enjoyed a good life. The second grievance was about the boot camp for troubled teens where he was sent. Mark felt his father had simply gotten rid of him this way. Third, Randy wouldn't give him the keys to his pickup truck. On Friday evening, the teenager wanted to drive his father's car to a party. Any reasonable adult would understand why the man acted as he did. After all, Mark was only 16 and had repeatedly demonstrated irresponsibility. But for Mark himself, this was the last straw. They even had a physical fight over it. The teenager decided that very evening, Randy would say goodbye to life. When Brandon asked Mark what he planned to do with Dedra, Chelsea, and Shalisa, who would surely be in the house, he replied that no witnesses could be left. At first, his friends thought Duke was joking and wouldn't do anything. Everyone knew Mark cared for these little girls and loved them like sisters. But it turned out this wasn't actually the case. Before the attack, Mike Ellison got 2 pistols, .45 and .32 caliber. Then they carefully wiped the weapons and bullets with a black bandana to remove possible DNA traces or fingerprints. 2 guys stayed in the car while Mark and Brandon went to Randy's house, where 2 adults and 2 children were at the time. Randy and Dedra were watching TV on the couch, while Chelsea and Shalisa were drawing with pencils at the coffee table. Mark approached his father, pointing the gun right at his face. Randy tried to calm his son, saying all disagreements could be resolved peacefully. The man apparently didn't even consider the possibility that the teenager might shoot. Mark said he was tired of Randy and his instructions, then fired a bullet into his father's cheek. In an attempt to defend himself, Randy grabbed what was at hand. It was a soft toy cat. He threw it at Mark, but the latter wasn't about to back down. However, he missed the second time. Brandon didn't mention that he also shot at Randy, but the autopsy showed the man was killed by bullets of different calibers. When the homeowner fell, Mark approached and fired his third and final shot at point-blank range. Dedra, still on the couch, panicked. She knew she needed to get her daughters away quickly, but couldn't because Brandon shot her. The teen aimed for her head, but the bullet hit her jaw, knocked out several teeth, and threw her back on the couch without knocking her unconscious. The mother's priority was saving her girls. She grabbed Shalisa and ran upstairs to hide. Chelsea managed to dash ahead. Dedra ran, bleeding, while Brandon stopped her with shots, one of which hit its mark. The bullet went through her arm and into her chest, but Dedra kept running. The mother was determined to protect her children. Older Chelsea hid under a bed in one of the upstairs bedrooms, while Dedra and Shalisa barricaded themselves in the master bedroom's bathroom. To ensure his father's death, Mark struck him so forcefully that the handle broke. He dropped the blade near the body and went upstairs. Meanwhile, Brandon tried to break down the bathroom door where Dedra and Shalisa were hiding. Mark helped him make a hole in the panel. He then reached in, opened the door, and turned the handle. The woman and daughter were sitting on the floor, huddled together. Mark put Shalisa in the shower and closed the curtain so she wouldn't see what he was about to do. Dedra bowed her head, begging the teens to let her and the girls go. But Mark heartlessly aimed at her forehead and said she was as bad as Randy. She was always telling him what to do. The boy mercilessly pulled the trigger. This was the last bullet, so they had to continue using butcher knives. Brandon hesitated, but Mark insisted they couldn't leave witnesses. The older brother, as the girls considered him, calmed Shalisa, saying it would hurt only for a moment, and put the knife to her neck. Then the teens searched the rooms for Chelsea and finally found her hiding under the bed. The little girl resisted with all her might and even managed to injure Brandon and Mark during the struggle, but the odds were against her. While Mark held Chelsea with both hands, Brandon used his knife. This crime was so evil and senseless that even Brandon himself couldn't explain why he blindly followed Mark's orders. During his account, the teenager showed no emotion, no remorse or regret. The boys went downstairs, and Mark reached into his dead father's pocket and stole his wallet. Then they ran to the nearest lake, washed their hands, cleaned their clothes as best they could, and threw the knives into a storm drain. To create an alibi, Brandon and Mark went with Mike and David to a movie theater about 15 minutes away. They bought tickets for the horror film Scream, but only watched the last half hour, though they kept the stubs proving the movie started at 10 p.m. On Saturday, they played pool and ate at a cafe as if nothing had happened. On Sunday morning, Mark returned to the crime scene, having a brilliant idea to make it look like a gang member had tried to get revenge on Randy. He carved rival gang signs on the bedroom wall, as if they were targeting him. Then Mark wiped fingerprints everywhere he thought they might be. He scattered belongings to simulate a robbery. Then he hung out with friends for the rest of the day, hoping someone else would discover the bodies and call the police. However, this didn't happen. Mark had to show up at home on Sunday anyway to avoid suspicion. Here he made a mistake, telling the dispatcher that his whole family was dead. The butcher knives were found in the storm drain. They still had bloodstains and hair on them. Brandon Samra and Mark Duke were charged with capital murder. They were arrested on Wednesday, March 26th. The two other teenagers, Mike and David, were charged with aiding and abetting premeditated murder. Each received a $1 million bail. The police worked tirelessly for 3 days and were able to solve the case. Tommy Hunt's life changed forever. He lost 2 daughters and a woman he once loved deeply. He had to move out of the house with so many memories of the deceased because he couldn't stay there anymore. All 4 boys pleaded not guilty and applied for juvenile offender status, which would have reduced their sentences to just 3 years. Fortunately, they were denied. The state prosecutor sought the death penalty for Brandon and Mark. Both young men were placed in solitary confinement for their own safety, as they received threats from other inmates for their actions against Chelsea and Chalisa. The trial of Brandon took place in March 1998. The Hunt family attended the trial wearing pink ribbons in memory of the deceased girls. By unanimous jury decision, Brandon Samra was sentenced to death, despite efforts by his lawyers. In March 1999, Mark Ellison and David Collins pleaded guilty and received lighter sentences, getting only 16 years each. At Mark Duke's trial, Brandon, already sentenced to death, testified as a witness. The entire audience cried when he recounted the events of that evening. Only Mark showed no reaction, as he was shocked by his friend's participation in this process. Evidence supporting Brandon's words was also presented by the prosecution, so his account was largely accurate. No matter how hard Mark's lawyers tried to defend their client, they failed. Mark Anthony Duke was also initially sentenced to death, but later his sentence was commuted to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole in accordance with a U.S. Supreme Court decision prohibiting the execution of criminals who committed their crimes as minors. Mark was only 16 when he decided to punish his family. His friend Michael Brandon Samra was 19 when the boys took the lives of innocent people, and he was not covered by the new law. On May 15, 2019, he was executed by lethal injection. Thorsby School built a gym in memory of their students, giving children the opportunity to laugh, joke, play, and exercise. This was the best way to honor Chalisa and Chelsea, as well as their loving mother Dedra and their second father Randy, because as cliché as it may sound, only one thing is stronger than evil, and that is love. This is the end of the story. Like the video and leave your thoughts in the comments. This was Jeremy. See you soon.